Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Let's get into the latest from Russia, where the big story today is the growing mismatch between Moscow's ability to continue fighting and its ability to protect the systems that support that fight. Ukraine is increasingly targeting the infrastructure behind Russia's war effort, and the latest developments show a campaign aimed less at individual military targets and more at forcing Russia to spend resources defending everything at once. The most important update is happening around Crimea, where Ukraine is applying sustained pressure against one of Russia's most important military platforms. Over the past several weeks, Kyiv has expanded strikes against fuel supplies, power infrastructure, transportation routes, and Russian military assets on the peninsula. The latest strikes against Russian vessels transporting fuel through the Sea of Azov are another example of Ukraine trying to make Crimea harder to supply and harder to operate. This matters because Crimea is not just symbolic for Moscow. Since Russia seized the peninsula in 2014, it has become a major logistics hub for operations in southern Ukraine. It supports naval activity, air operations, supply routes, and Russian forces operating deeper into occupied territory. Ukraine's goal is to create a situation where Russia technically controls Crimea, but increasingly struggles to use it effectively. The impact is already visible. Russian-installed officials in Crimea have acknowledged widespread power disruptions, and emergency measures have been introduced. The problem for Moscow is that these are not isolated incidents. Ukraine is creating a series of problems that compound each other. Fuel shortages affect transportation. Power disruptions affect communications and industry. Damaged logistics routes make military resupply more difficult, and that pressure is exposing a major Russian vulnerability: air defense. One of the more interesting developments over the last few days has been the criticism coming from Russia's own pro-war commentators. These are not anti-Kremlin voices. Many support the war and argue that Russia should fight harder, but they are increasingly frustrated that the government has failed to create a coordinated system to defend the country's rear areas. Several Russian military bloggers have argued that Russia's air defense structure is fragmented, with different organizations responsible for different pieces of the problem. The military protects some areas, regional governments handle others, and private companies are left trying to purchase their own solutions. Their argument is that Ukraine has found the seams in that system. That criticism is significant because it touches on something deeper: Russia's long-standing belief that geography protects it. For decades, Russian strategic thinking has relied on distance as a shield. The size of the country was considered an advantage, but inexpensive drones and longer-range strike systems are changing that calculation. Ukraine has demonstrated that even facilities thousands of kilometers from the front line can be vulnerable. That reality is now reaching ordinary Russians. The most visible example is the ongoing fuel disruption. Russia remains one of the world's largest oil producers, yet residents in Moscow and other regions are experiencing long lines at gas stations, rationing, and concerns about availability. Some local governments have restricted fuel purchases and taken emergency steps to manage shortages. The political impact is still uncertain. The Kremlin has survived much more serious crises, and the Russian security apparatus remains highly effective at controlling dissent. But the challenge for Moscow is that the war is becoming harder to separate from everyday life. A decade ago, Putin's political brand was built heavily around restoring order and stability after the uncertainty of the post-Soviet period. Now, images of fuel lines and damaged infrastructure create a very different picture. The Kremlin is responding by tightening control over the information environment. Russian authorities have reportedly instructed state-aligned media outlets to reduce coverage of Ukrainian strikes inside Russia and instead emphasize Russian attacks on Ukraine. The goal is familiar: shape public perception and limit evidence that the war is coming closer to home. At the same time, Russia is trying to adapt militarily. Ukraine's mid-range drone campaign has become one of the defining developments of this phase of the war, and Russia is now working to counter it. Ukrainian drone operators report that Russian forces are deploying electronic warfare systems designed to disrupt communications, including systems aimed at interfering with Starlink-connected drones. Russia is also changing how it protects supplies. Ukrainian commanders say Russian forces are using smaller convoys, civilian vehicles, concealed storage sites, and other methods to make logistics harder to detect and strike. This is becoming a constant technological competition. Ukraine finds a new vulnerability. Russia develops a countermeasure. Ukraine adjusts again. It is a cycle that has defined much of this war. Meanwhile, Zelensky is taking the broader argument to NATO leaders in Ankara. His message is that Ukraine has proven it can innovate and fight, but it needs help with one specific challenge: protecting cities from Russian ballistic missile attacks. Recent Russian strikes against Kiev highlighted the problem. Ukraine has become highly effective at intercepting drones and cruise missiles, but ballistic missiles remain difficult because they require advanced systems like Patriot. Zelensky is pushing European countries to provide additional Patriot interceptors and is also asking for permission to produce Patriot systems with U.S. support. The larger issue is industrial capacity. The war has exposed that advanced air defense systems cannot simply be produced overnight when demand suddenly increases. Ukraine is arguing that the solution is not only more deliveries, but expanded production. That same industrial argument is shaping Ukraine's growing defense relationships with Europe. Kyiv has signed additional drone cooperation agreements with Denmark, Estonia, and the Netherlands, building on a model where Ukraine shares battlefield-tested technology in exchange for investment and manufacturing partnerships. Ukraine has effectively become a proving ground for modern warfare. Countries looking at future conflicts are studying what Kyiv has learned about drones, electronic warfare, and rapid adaptation. Russia is also facing challenges beyond the battlefield. The reported arrest of Major General Yuri Zizikin, commander of the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade, on corruption charges is another example of internal friction within the Russian military establishment. The Kremlin has historically used corruption investigations both as genuine anti-corruption efforts and as a mechanism for removing officials who have lost political support. At the strategic level, Moscow continues deepening its military relationship with Belarus. Recent nuclear-related exercises and the deployment of Russian systems there further integrate Belarus into Russia's military posture. The result is that Belarus is becoming less of an independent buffer and more of a forward position for Russian military planning near NATO's eastern members. Russia is also continuing its broader intelligence and influence operations across Europe. Recent cases in Italy and Serbia involving alleged Russian-linked espionage and sabotage activity highlight that Moscow's confrontation with the West extends well beyond Ukraine's borders. Thanks for listening. If you value clear, consistent analysis, leaving a review or a comment helps others discover the show. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, offering deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Appreciate your time. Have a great day.